Paul, let's get right to stimulus, because this is the news, and you've weighed in on this, many columns, big debates, so many things. The size has become a political football, as you know. If you were to extract politics from this, looking solely through an economic lens, is there anything if you were the virus relief czar, something you might remove or change, or would you say, no, this is perfect and leave it just as it is?
Oh, it's not perfect. There are things, I mean, it's kind of a mixture of politics and just administrative capacity. Those $1,400 checks are not the best targeted thing in the world. You want something like that to reach people who are going to fall through the cracks of the other programs. And if you had time and unlimited administrative capacity, and let's face it, if there weren't a political imperative to make good on promises, you might try for something that was a little bit more targeted than that. But, you know, borrowing is cheap. Money is really kind of not an object, amazingly, in all of this stuff. And you really want to get a lot of aid out the door fast. You not have to get people through these 6-7 months of pandemic, and we need to have the economy poised to make a fast comeback once it can.
Okay, well, as you know, better than anybody, you were in a very interesting debate with Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary. He was on Bloomberg Television, our Bloom Street Week edition on Friday. And let's listen to what he said about what you have said.
I'd rather see us investing money that expands the economy's capacity than simply making transfer payments. What's remarkable is that the advocates of this program, like Paul Krugman, when you put to them that it may overheat the economy, they say, no, it won't. People will save the money and people will use it to pay down debts. And I can't imagine a lower priority use of federal resources.
You know, Paul, what is your response? Because I think part of the answer here, too, and the question is, are we going to put money that is not as targeted as well as it could be take it away from things that we could be putting money into and putting it in the plan right now this year, like climate change, infrastructure spending that would create jobs and help so many people?
Yeah, I have enormous respect for Larry. I always take him seriously, but I think he's making a category error here. He's thinking that the constraint is that we have a certain amount of money and we're going to spend it on this or we're going to spend it on that. But that's not actually a problem. The U.S. government has vast borrowing capacity. And the constraint on doing the things we ought to be doing is not how much money is there, can we afford it? The constraint is actually, in the end, it's going to be political. I'm very much for a big infrastructure invest in the future program, but that's going to be taking place not this year, maybe not even next year, but afterwards. And it's not, the reasons it might not happen are going to be if people feel, well, you spent a lot of money and it didn't work and the economy didn't recover all that well, which is what happened to Obama. So in fact, spending on pandemic recovery now, spending generously, is not a competing with a longer run investment program. In fact, it's a precondition for that longer run investment program. We need to get people back to work, and we need to get people through this with minimum damage. And only then will we be in a position to go about doing the things that Larry and I both agree we ought to be doing, looking past this year.
So we know that for countries like the US and China, for example, the ability to service that debt, the ability to borrow, as you say, is not of a concern. Are you concerned about productivity of debt, though? Because if you take a look at the Chinese example, that's the very worry, right? The effectiveness of taking on that debt and how it's targeted.
Well, there's no effective constraint on the amount of debt. I mean, with the U.S., we have just barely got positive interest rates on 30-year bonds now, real interest rates, and still negative real interest rates on shorter term. And with given the fact that the economy will grow over time, servicing the debt is just not going to be a problem. So I really don't worry about it. It's the level of debt is not in my top 10 list of things to worry about, whereas being able to get people through this crisis with minimum financial, personal damage is sort of near the top of the list. And then, yeah, building support for the idea that the government can do good things so that we can, in fact, go and address the longer term, address climate change, address our deteriorating infrastructure. That's what you need to do. And you don't do that by nitpicking at the details and saying, oh, well, there's a few $1 billion here that maybe is not going to exactly the right people.
So some people worry about the debt burden for the future generations. Some people worry about the output gap. Others, worry about, as you say, this sort of firefighting, whatever it takes just to get through the immediate crisis. What do you think is the most useful, I guess, construct to understand this crisis, which you and other economists have said is unlike anything that we've seen before, and therefore clearly that has to filter into the way that we deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, the crisis, the economic crisis, is much more like a natural disaster than it is like a conventional recession. And fighting it is like disaster relief. It's also in some ways like fighting a war. We have to fight directly. We need to fight the pandemic. We need to get shots in arms and schools reopen safely and all of that stuff. But also, it's about, again, making it survivable, making sure that people's incomes are supported, that state and local governments aren't forced into crippling cuts in services. I mean, I'm in New York City here right now. Keeping the subways and buses running is all part of this. And when you're trying to fight a war, when you're faced with a temporary emergency that is temporary, but it's huge, you don't say, okay, how big is the output gap? How big should our military budget be to close the output gap? You say, what will it take to win this war? And what we want to be doing now is we need to say, how much do we need to spend now? We can afford this. How much do we need to spend to get there? And the answer is something close to this $1.9 trillion we're talking about.